Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the author, academic, musician. It's the one and only Mark Goodall, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry, all the other groovy stuff. Also, he has written a book very recently titled Bright Young Things, The Art and Philosophy of el.e. Records. So this is the interview, which is very exciting. The book has just come out and is available from all good bookshops and also online as well. It's an absolutely brilliant publication, beautifully put together and very fascinating to delve into. But this is going to be the interview, which is going to be a lot about Mark's early years as well as el.e. Records as well. So sit back, relax, enjoy, and do take notes because there's a lot to contemplate. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject that was kind of the musical journey of a person excited in music. Anyway, we're just going to have to launch into it. Mark, it's over to you.
I think it's interesting how because I think you come to music in a non-linear way. You know, if you tell your musical story, you can put it in order and say it was into punk, then new wave, then this, then that. But actually, sometimes for me, it didn't work like that. So I was into punk and then went back to the Beatles and rock music and got into that when I first started playing in bands, which was out of order, out of sync. So I think it doesn't always just follow in the historical way. You know, you come at things at odd times. And then there's things like jazz and classical music, which I had absolutely no interest in at all, apart from one particular jazz band, which was an anomaly anyway. And then I discovered that later. So if you're just curious about music, you will find stuff all the time. Yes. From all eras that you missed, as you said at the beginning. So that's how it worked for me. It wasn't just I'm into that and this has come along and now I'm listening to that. I was going backwards and forwards all the time.
Yes, and the weird thing was that period when my brother did have Sgt. Pepper in that record collection, and that was probably 74, 75. So the Beatles, had only just really broken up, but it did seem like they were from a very different period. But then there was this album that I became obsessed with and was curious because of the lyrics and the music, and it was such a lot of variety. But obviously there was no cultural context in 1975 of this album. But again, it's ensconced in my brain. But then there was the Beatles films that you watched, and then there was the Cliff Richard films, and there was the Monkees, and there was things that you kind of, even at a young age, you realise, well, this is a bit naff and they're manufactured, but the Beatles are the real thing. And then just becoming curious with those two albums that people had, the blue compilation, the red compilation, and at quite an early age, you sort of found, how they musically progressed without really overthinking it, because you were probably about 13.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was quite interesting, but again, one wasn't really access to streaming at that point. It was all very immediate, so and different. But then when you got to 16, which was 1981, indeed, did you leave school at that age? Did you, was school that, or did you go on to A levels?
I did A levels I did one A level art at school, and that's when I got into music. So that's when I was in my first bands, and they were sort of more rock and blues influenced, because there was a guy at school who was a bit of a virtuoso, and that sort of changes your taste a bit, because he liked really flash guitarists like Alvin Lee and Clapton, people like that, which I wasn't really aware of. So then you're trying to be a musician, which was not kind of what punk seemed to be about. I know it's oversimplifying it to say you could just do 3 chords. It was never just 3 chords. It was at least 4 or 5. But still that spirit, just get something and make a noise. And then the muso stuff came in. So, which I think is probably a very sixth form thing, isn't it? Sort of sitting around, sort of stroking your chin, listening to trying to impress people with your musical knowledge.
Yes.
So that happened then.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in North Yorkshire, in a village in North Yorkshire called Great Ayton, which is where Captain Cook went to school.
Right, nice.
Yeah, not a very exciting place.
A blue
The
plaque.
nearest exciting place was Middlesbrough.
Right, so
where we used to go for all our
So
records.
once you'd done your A-level in art,
yeah,
it was kind of strange because this was, I would imagine the art kids at that time would have started to get into, new romantic dressing up, the Blitz kids. I mean, I know you're quite a long way from that world, but started to sort of develop some interests and ideas and be frivolous, but not into blues rock. That was quite
No, that went. So then you had, and of course I went to art school because I thought that's what you did to form a band. That's what I'd read that, was the route.
Yes.
And it was still true then, for the reasons you said, that you meet a load of other arty kids who were really interested. And I think also what I liked about that period was that with the music press, especially the NME, you were absorbing other things, not just music. So they would write about film and books. And so you would pick that up, as well. And it was more of a mix and there'd be stuff about art. So it was a good era for that, for actually being quite well versed in lots of different things. So art school was still good, important.
So were you going through a period of like Mike Leigh films like Meantime and the David Lynch, Eraserhead, and then Betty Blue and these kind of classics that we used to all get angsty about?
Yeah. There was the art centre where I was in York, where I went to art school, they had films, and it was like Tarkovsky and European, serious films. But I think it was a good education, that, because it was watching films that you hadn't seen before, I suppose it was the start of Channel 4 having their film nights and things, and BBC Two with people like Alex Cox. But you were watching things that you just didn't even know what they were, they were long and serious and strange. But again,
shadowy shadows.
But it kind of tied in with factory records and those kind of things, and people singing weird lyrics that were about, that weren't just about sort of love. Or if they were, it was a weird version of love. So yeah, all that mixed together, and trying to be in a band, but like an indie band then. So you're talking like the Smiths and the Postcard stuff, Aztec Camera, Prefab Sprout, the more tuneful guitar stuff, the C81 stuff, really. Not the new romantics, not the electronic stuff. I never really, at that time, I really didn't get that. It was still guitar based.
Yes. And was it guitar that you had gone in, rhythm guitar?
Yeah, so I was in a band, but I was the guitarist and singer, and York wasn't very exciting. I guess it still isn't really, but there was Red Rhino, which was the big thing.
Right.
For some reason, that was in York, and so they had a great shop, and you could, but the music scene was quite poor, really. So we didn't get anywhere with that.
No. And then what happened after your three years of art school?
So then I moved to, well, no, I didn't. What you were talking about art school? So that was a foundation year. So after a year, I didn't even finish that. I just formed this band in York, played in the band, tried to get a record deal. Got some great rejection letters, which I still got, including one from Cherry Red. We said this record. So something like, "Thanks for your record. It was interesting, but made me feel nauseous," or something like that. It was a strange thing to say. So that didn't work. And then I moved to Edinburgh, and I played in a band there called Goodbye, Mr. Mackenzie, who had a modest kind of success.
My God, I did an interview with the lead singer a few years ago. Martin, he was, Martin. And I saw them
and
play
Shirley Manson.
Of course, Shirley was the one. I saw them at the UEA once. Were you in the band for much of the 80s?
No, I was only in the band wasn't in the band for long. I think they just released that single, and they were on the same label as Wet, 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 or the same management company. And there was just an advert saying the guitarist wanted to be good. I didn't really know they were because I'd just moved up there. So I went to see Martin and talked to him for a bit. And then I did some gigs with them. I didn't do any recording. That was a good experience, but I didn't fit in. I remember do you remember A Certain Ratio, the factory band? I had a badge with A Certain Ratio on. And he was looking at it one day at the bus stop, and he said, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, it's A Certain Ratio." And he went, "Who's that?" And I thought, if you don't know who A Certain Ratio are, I don't think this is the right band for me. He wanted to be David Bowie, really.
Yes.
So that didn't last. And Shirley said to me, "Oh, we're looking for someone a bit more rocky." So I said, "Oh, yeah, it's not right. I can't do that."
No,
because I was influenced by all that Prefab Sprout stuff and the kind of jangly guitars and the Joseph K type thing, a trebly and abrasive, and that they wanted who they ended up with was the guy from Exploited, Big John.
Big John.
So that was who they wanted, not me.
No. Yes,
there's a big difference.
It was a bit of a strange. So then after the Edinburgh, or Goodbye, Mr. Mackenzie, what happened next?
Yeah, then I came back to Leeds, and because my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, she knew Leeds. She'd been a student in Leeds, so we said, let's go back to Leeds. That hasn't worked out in Edinburgh. So I came back to Leeds, and then I joined a post-punk band, like a noise. So that was the time of Sonic Youth, Big Black, Butthole Surfers, Fugazi.
What about Husker Du?
That was happening. And I went to see Big Black at Leeds Poly, and I was just blown away. I just thought, this is so intense. So I met this guy who was more of a punk, and we did a few gigs, did some albums, played with lots of interesting bands. Didn't play with Husker Du, but that was different again. That was making a noise. It was going back to punk. And I enjoyed it for a bit, but then got fed up with that. And then I formed another band that was going back to the indie stuff, which is the band I'm in now, which is called Rudolf Rocker, which is just a 3-piece.
Right. Because because with Leeds at that point, there was a big squat and a narco anarchist movement. Yes, there was. Lots of kind of, there was the Chumbawambas, and that scene, and also, I know a few people who went there having it was all a gap year, you'd do A-levels, you'd go to Leeds, squat for a year and then go on. So there was quite a few people with big jumpers, and they knew Danbert, or they knew various, Boff and all that kind of world. And there was the Duchess was the main venue, was it? Well, one of them, wasn't it? And I had was it the Warehouse, this guy who's put on this mega 3-day festival, which had all those kind of interesting bands. That was quite early 80s, wasn't it?
Yeah, you talk about Futurama.
Yes.
I think, they were interesting. Yeah, definitely. That was I think the first one was at the Queen's Hall, which has been demolished. The first two were pretty good, and I think there might be another one. That's John Keenan. He's still around. Actually.
Yes, I think he's doing a talk very soon, isn't he? He is. And I met his kind of, not nemesis, but the other chap who put on gigs around that time, who apparently they gave each other space. I was all, okay.
Well, the guy we know is called Steve Hawkins, who he was strange. He had a record label that had AC Temple and people like that on. I don't know if it was him, but he wasn't really. He was a promoter, so he put on people like Pere Ubu, and some other bands. Steve Hawkins. He was.
Yes, I can't.
Steve Albini. He put Rape Man on. When Albini had his
follow-up
band.
He unfortunately no.
Yeah.
Yes, that didn't go down well with.
No. Well, we went to interview because we had a fanzine at the time. So and actually, he was very charming and very good at trying to explain what he was doing. But there was a big protest. There was like a group of people outside, like boycotting, trying to stop people going in. It was quite intense.
Yes, I could imagine.
To understand it. Interesting. Just before he died, I saw an interview with him where he said that was a mistake, and he was looking back and saying he didn't know why he did that, and he can see why people were so upset by it.
Yes,
so it's kind of interesting.
It was a bit of and there was another one. Was it another guy called, I think, something Evans, who was a bit of a scenester, went on to do a record label in the Mark Tokczek. It's spelled Toczek.
Well, there's Nick Tokczek, who's from Bradford. He's a poet. He was a sort of poet, and he was in bands, but is you thinking of him?
Yes, that was who.
Yeah, you're right. He did promote some stuff. He actually had a comedy club in Bradford, which had all the comedians that are now famous, like Coogan. They all played there. That was in the 80s. So he's an interesting character. I know him quite well because where I work at the university in Bradford, and we gave him an honorary degree like 2 years ago. Nick Tokczek, and
yes.
I'm doing an event with him actually in June about the alternative music scene in Bradford. He's comparing it, so he's still around. He's still very active.
Yes.
So if it's him, if that's the guy you're thinking of,
that was the one. Yes, I interviewed him a few months ago actually. Because he
might have been a guy called Richard Ruska. I don't know if you think.
Oh yes, I've come across him too.
Yeah,
and he's done a compilation. Compiled the Leeds compilation, didn't he?
Okay. Yeah, that might be him. So yeah, there were a few characters in Leeds.
Yes, I was just trying to work out. There was a few. Yeah, there was a. I'm trying.
Wedding Present was sort of quite big at the time.
My God! And in the end of August, early September, there is going to be an event in Leeds, the Wedding Present musical.
Okay, the musical. Wow.
The musical or the Wedding Present. So be prepared for that.
In fact, I remember Steve. I wonder if this is going to be in the musical. Steve Hawkins put them on at a venue. It was a bit out of Leeds, massive venue, and he didn't have any security. And what he didn't realise was that the Wedding Present had acquired this sort of Leeds United sort of football following of quite thuggish characters. And it was apt. And he said to us when halfway through the first few songs, he said, "Oh, can you go on the stage and be security?" And we were like, "You're joking? Have you seen these guys?" So I just remember that I just thought he's one of the, when you think this is going to go really, when you hear about things that just go completely out of control. But anyway, it didn't quite do that, but it was horrific. I can't believe you haven't got any. You don't know this.
No.
They'll remember it with Dave Gedge, and we got to know the bass player because he was a big fan of Rudolf Rocker. What's his Keith? Is he called Keith?
Did you see the film the guy that I interviewed was called Nick Evans, who went on to do Elemental Records, and he was part of the Leeds scene.
Was he a punk? Was he like an anarcho-punk?
Yes, he was anarcho-punk.
I remember him. He was a very posh anarcho-punk. I mean, you were talking about the squatting scene. Some of the guys we used to play with, they lived in real, slum conditions, but he had quite a nice house with like proper kitchen and everything. And I was thinking, yeah, God, I'd forgotten about him.
Yeah, so because he's
still around then doing things.
Yes, he's very big in yoga.
Of course. Well, there you go. That's what he was building up to.
Yes, so there you go. But anyway, he's still but he went on to do this record label called Elemental Records in the 90s.
I didn't know that.
So yes, there's kind of interest. Yeah, but anyway, the Wedding Present, the musical is being written and is going to be performed at the end of August, early September. Right. So Amazing. There you go. I think it's going to be one of those I spoke to the writer director, and it's going to be about a group of friends in the 80s, finishing university, relationships, and then coming up with the songs of the wedding present. So quite niche, but there you go. Check it out.
Well,
But
it worked for ABBA and the Beatles, so that's
yes, so we'll see if that one's a winner. But anyway, it should be a good event. So yes, then what happened to you in the 90s?
So then I was in this other band, the Rudolf Rocker, which was myself, my brother Steve, who I was in the York band with, and a guy called Jeremy Dyson, who's a writer. He was in the League of Gentlemen. In fact, the
Right.
League of Gentlemen were just starting when I met him at Waterstones. I was working in Waterstones at Leeds, and we just got on. And anyway, so we formed this band that was with just the three of us, and we're still going. In fact, we're recording another album now at Jeremy's house in Ilkley.
Fantastic.
So that's quite an interesting thing. And we actually, one of our bits of music was used in the League of Gentlemen. I don't know if you know it, but there's a sort of terrible failed rock star called Les McQueen, and his band, the band he was in, reformed without him. And there's an episode where they're playing this song called Voodoo Lady in this pub, and that's ours. That's us. That's our song, Voodoo Lady. We're just miming to it. So that was our claim to fame, that we had we were creme brulee for 5 minutes. And we should have capitalized on that and done, but we're idiots, so we didn't. So, but anyway, we're still going. So, but we're just, we work at a snail's pace because we're all doing different things and we all live in different places. So,
yes, really. And so you got a Bandcamp page.
Yes.
And you're doing it all there. Blimey,
Yeah.
This is very exciting. So then, how did you then sort of develop your academic career?
Yeah, well, that happened after Waterstones. That just grew out. I mean, I just fell into it, to be honest. Some of my tutors are because this is really long-winded. I don't know if this is any use to you at all, but so the York Art School thing was short-lived. Then I went back when I was older to Bradford Art School to do my degree properly. And then it was after that I worked in Waterstones, and some of my tutors from Bradford came in and said, "Oh, we need someone to do some teaching. Can you do it?" So they remembered that I was quite a sort of smart student, because I was a mature student. So I took it seriously then. I was 21 when I did my degree. So no, 23. Yeah, 23. So I was miles more, mature than most of my fellow students. So they remembered that I was quite good, and they just said, "Can you do some teaching?" And I did, and then just fell into doing that more until it became a full-time thing. And then I got into the research side of being an academic, where you could just, write about something and publish it, and just love. This is really good. So that's what I've been doing. So the academic stuff and the Rudolf Rocker stuff, and I made a few films as well along the way and stuff, because what I was teaching there was film, going back to film, this multidisciplinary thing that punk was, and post-punk. Yeah, it's just a mishmash of all sorts of stuff, just tons of stuff all over.
Yes, well, it's always exciting.
Really complicated. Yeah, it's got. Yes, it is. And a lot of those things like the university sector is falling apart. So a lot of the things we grew up with as certainties and definitely jobs for life are not there anymore. It's all falling apart.
Yes.
It's kind of going back to how it was before, where you'll just have a few elite institutions for rich kids, and everyone else will be in a call center.
Yeah, I mean the wage, people aren't going to be able to earn enough to have a life or living that gives them any hope, really.
Well, I don't know about you, but I left home when I was 18. I never went back. So my daughter lives here still with us. She's 25. So it's
yes, I
completely
know.
changed.
Well, we were very desperate to go in and out and having the mattress on the floor and a bit of kind of freedom, really. Whereas that's very different. But then, in those days there was the grant, wasn't there? Your 3-year grant and your housing benefits, and and the having started doing this show, and I thought, yeah, it'd be interesting to interview some of these bands. But I didn't realise quite how many there were. So it's like, my God, I must one day finish this. But it's quite tricky when you think, God, that's nearly 1,300 interviews. But there was like such a high unemployment, which on one level is like, that's not great. But then it gave people a sort of an indirect grant to live for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
There was job seekers allowance, enterprise allowance schemes. It was like, okay, let's do it. And every city and town had an alternative indie night, so you could get your transit van and suddenly have dates around the country playing to people. And you had the gatekeepers like John Peel and Janice Long, in a way, the 3 music papers that had huge circulation. So you could almost guarantee getting 100 to 200 people coming to a show around the country from and it gave people that momentum to do the John Peel session, the first album, the Tricky second, possibly the third. But it was, there was a certain, there was a bit of an apprenticeship of life, wasn't there?
A strange infrastructure, which wasn't really a designed one, but there was a network. I've heard Jarvis Cocker talking about this, and I think people thought it was a bit of a joke, but because he said, "Oh well, having unemployment benefit is what allowed so many bands to develop, to have the time and the space to develop." And people just said, "Well, that's just self-indulgent." But he's right. You could to do that. You could take the time to develop your art.
Yes,
As long as you're
definitely.
prepared to live, in shit.
Yes, on tins of tomatoes and TVP.
That you weren't bothered. You're not bothered about that when you're young. You don't care.
No, you didn't.
So it was a sort of strange support network, which is obviously now completely gone because you can't get any of that support.
Yeah, it gave people that chance to not have to worry about turning up at 9 and then having to sort of do all the stuff you sometimes have to do. But at that age, it's quite freeing, really, and just going through it and getting excited by it and feeling quite like, wow, this is so rebellious, and I'm just going to bed at 2 a.m. and getting up at 10 or 11, and it was going to going to happy hour in the pub, and it was but it was kind of part of one's, we were kids. I mean, when you look back on it, you thought, God, we were still actually quite young, and going and looking in skips for things, and it was all part of one's growing up, wasn't it? So
and you had the time. I don't think kids now have got the time, or I mean, it's hard to work and then, but in your spare time, be creative. It's because you've got no end. You're knackered.
Yes, and you're sort of, and your mind is being filled with so many little distractions. Whereas going to a library in the 80s or 90s, you just had to avoid the odd weirdo, but you had time to sort of wander around and just look at books and get kind of interested, or just see something that's quite fascinating, or see an exhibition.
It all feeds into it. That's the point I'm making. You could watch weird films at the local art centre or the university film school, and you could hear bands in the local pub. You're not talking like now it's big venues, big ticket prices, booking fees, all that shit. It was really cheap to go.
It was £1.50 for 3 bands.
Exactly. The bands didn't make any money, but no one really cared. Libraries, good libraries. So you had a real, and the TV was better. You had more stuff on TV, like the Channel 4 films.
Yes, well, absolutely. I remember we all stayed up to watch Richard Pryor when he was on, and like I said, those films like Meantime or my lunch with Andre, my dinner with Andre.
Oh yeah, dinner with Andre. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you just, where can you?
And then becoming quite pretentious about Wings of Desire and all those kind of things, and black and white films, and yes, it was all good, Paris, Texas, and
I think it is good. I think it's because it's an alternative world. It's not. It's good for people to experience things they're not familiar with. I think now it's very easy to just absorb and consume what you already like, and all the algorithms are feeding you stuff that it thinks you like. And that was the opposite of that, where you just wouldn't know what you were going to see, and
yes,
you might think it was shit. And like you said earlier, 9 times out of 10 it would be. But the point is, you were just, and you might go away and think, "Oh, it's terrible," but it'll stayed in your head. You got a boring Herzog film, but it would still be there the next day or a week later, and you'd say, "Yeah, it was quite interesting. That something interesting about it. I remember one of the characters, or the setting, or
yes,
the
and it was.
sky. It was all about feeding your imagination, and you can't do that now because it's just tailored, packaged."
Well, there's one film. Films are weird because I know sometimes going back to watch them, they do look a bit dated,
Yeah,
and watching things like the comic strip is like
yeah,
sometimes a bit hit and miss, but kind of some hits in there. And there was films like Letter to Brezhnev, which
mm,
was the first. There was like scenes of two women, Margie Clark, on the
yeah,
toilet
yeah,
having a chat with her friend, and you would never have seen that
yeah.
on before. Just
No,
like it was all gritty and real, and
yeah.
and then we went back and watched the kitchen sink dramas of
Mm,
Taste of Honey and Saturday Night,
mm,
Sunday Morning, and Kind of Loving, and then you then sort of go, oh my God, I've got to get into the Beat Generation and read On the Road or Tom Wolfe or Hunter S. Thompson, because you
yeah,
just, oh, now I've got to listen to beat jazz because, that's
yeah.
the other thing that one's kind of missing in life. So it was kind of, I quite like that, and I still quite like
Mm,
things like that, but
mm,
it's not quite as, there anymore because I suppose one's kind of done it. But and watching James Dean films and getting kind of excited about them, and and then watching Taxi Driver and Mean Streets and all those Scorsese De Niro films. So
yeah.
yeah, it was kind of rich, but you really consumed it, and then you
Mm,
irritatedly imitated certain scenes in
mm.
front of people or the mirror.
But
Um,
you did it. It did lead you into interesting areas, and also think you read more as well. I mean, I did. I don't know about you, but I just read, absorbed, the Penguin modern classics and those sort of, vintage or whatever. Was it vintage? One of the publishers did all the American stuff.
yes,
And you kind of learn from doing that. It's a good discipline, I think.
yes,
But I
absolutely.
don't know. None of my if I ask any of my students what they read, first of all, they don't read, and if they do, it's quite bland and safe. And these are students, so it's the equivalent of me and you when we were 20 or 19. They're just not. They don't have the same appetite for just hoovering up everything, good and bad. It's all, oh
Yes.
no, I don't watch sci-fi, or I don't watch, film noir. They know they know what they don't like, but they don't what they do like is quite pedestrian.
Well, I suppose a lot of
So
people now get onto those streaming sites and watch the season of
yeah,
something, these
yeah,
rather than a. And the
yeah,
problem, what I've noticed with that is somebody said, "Have you seen this?" And everyone go, "No, but it's brilliant. You must." And then someone, so there's no common language. Whereas there
mm,
was like sometimes, if
yeah.
you watch Betty Blue, chances
Everyone else
are
had seen it.
everyone had watched it. So at least the conversation didn't go, "Oh no,
Yeah,
I never watched it,"
yeah, yeah.
or and we all sat through Eraserhead, and then went, "God, that was amazing." Oh,
It sounds like what you're doing is arguing for less choice, but actually there was a lot of choice. It's just that what is it? It's that you had these forums that curated it for you. So
yeah, you had art
because
cinemas, you had the Friday night,
everything that we saw and the things we wanted to see but we couldn't see are now on YouTube. But the point is, how do you know? How can you find it if you don't know anything about what you're looking for? So it's all there, but it also isn't.
Yes.
When
Well,
you start, when you type in weird film to Google, you'll get a very predictable set of things. Whereas if you go to if you were just watching films that some random guy was putting on at your local film society, then it really was a mixed bag.
yes, very mixed. And obviously, talking of time, we'd always have to do a mixtape for somebody that we
Yeah.
were hoping to get into a relationship with, which took
Mm,
days, if not weeks,
yeah.
to put that cassette together.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
because you
amazing
wouldn't.
amount of energy.
Yes, the segues and how much of a gap to leave, and then if it went wrong, you'd have to go back and do the whole thing again. You couldn't just
You know.
drop a little bit of cut a file out and trim it and drop it back in
And the
like
songs
you can
all meant so much because you just were trying to send a message but not making it too obvious. So the mixtape again,
do.
it was like you had to have that time, and then you have to find that record, and you thought, oh God, will they don't like heavy rock? Perhaps I should put that. So you make a cassette you didn't really like, but you were hoping the person would really love it, and think, oh my God, I think that's just everything I love. But then you got it completely wrong, and they never played it, and you thought, oh well, never
Well, maybe
mind.
they didn't play it, but but they must have at least appreciated the amount of work that I don't suppose people do they? It's like when you made a film and show it to people, they just go, "Oh yeah, it's all right." You think,
Yeah,
that
that's all
took
right.
me months.
Nights, yes,
People don't
watching the
care.
door.
They
No,
don't
this
care.
is true, but it was it was good. So then as we get to the book, because
Yeah.
obviously as you probably gather now that we've been. I mean, when I first started these interviews about 7 years, 8 years ago, there wasn't really much on the the indie scene, and the '80s narrative was kind of quite basic. It was a bit like told by people like Dylan Jones, and it was like the Blitz
Mm,
Kids,
mm,
Spandau Ballet, Sade, The Face, Live Aid. Then
yeah.
you had a bit of Thatcher and the miners' strike, and then everyone's been started to write their
Mm,
'80s and record
mm,
labels. So
mm.
when did your interest come about? Your sort of publication?
Well, it took me a while to. I keep saying this, I know, but to everyone, but it's important. Is that it didn't it didn't it wasn't like I discovered L Records when they released the first record and then became a fan and collected everything. It took me a long time to put together the pieces of L because on the one hand you've got great indie bands, Monochrome Set, although they weren't really on L for very properly. Would Be Goods,
Yes.
those kind of things, and then the early L stuff like Shock Eddie Peters, and but then you had they started bringing out sort of football compilations and film soundtracks, Caravaggio. So and what happened was I kept seeing this name, Mike Alway. I'd buy something or listen to something, and then notice that name on it, and I thought this guy's interesting. Even they had a football night on BBC Two in the early '90s, football evening, and the first thing they showed was this little film about the 1970 Brazil team, World Cup team, with music by Primal Scream. It was like a montage of archive footage of Brazil and people talking about the team and why they were good. Really exhilarating, just great. And then at the end it said Mike Alway, directed by Mike Douglas Hart and Mike Alway. So I thought, oh, it's him again. It took me a long time to put the pieces of L together and say, oh, this is interesting. This is an interesting label in its own right. That's totally unique. There's nothing else like it, and it's because it's got all these disparate elements coming together. And when you now, because you can do it with the internet, when you get the discography and lay it all out, you can see it's a really interesting story and one that's not known.
No.
So I mean, we've just talked for ages about how you developed in that post-punk era, and it was about something different. It was about the philosophy was do something different. Don't just repeat what's come before. The punk thing was do your own thing, and then you'll keep generating new ideas, and that. So I thought at the time I thought of doing the album, which wasn't that long ago, there'd been, like you said, there'd been a lot of stuff about Factory, about Rough Trade, about Oasis, Creation, and nothing about labels like el.e. So it was a kind of a bit of the Smiths. So it was a bit of a sort of Joy Division. The Joy Division industry was just starting really then, it really took off. So it was just, it was a nice little story that no one else was telling. And I thought, let's do it while everyone's still around.
Yes.
And it won't be earth shattering, but it will at least be a little record of that particular part of the indie story.
I know, it's quite, yes, it's quite a fascinating one. And because I've sort of tried to sort of find the labels or some of the producers or even some of the studios, and just sort of you sort of piece little things together. And even the most bizarre story of this, it was to do with Dan Tracy and Alan McGee, where I think it was the very early 80s, where they were sort of at one gig, and there was a German chap called Thomas was there. And then, he just wanted to come and see Dan Tracy. And then went back to Germany sort of for the next decade and so, became a promoter for all these indie bands in Germany. And I just love those kind of connections and stories. And that was the start of his kind of life. So there was a very organic quality to it. So did you get to meet or interview Mike?
Yes, I did. Yeah. So I thought the first place to pitch this idea is obviously Cherry Red, because the Cherry Red backed el.e. It was their part of their, the label was part of their empire, if you like. And they had a book. They have published some books, as you probably know, about music. So I thought, well, this is a straight winner, because it's their label.
Yes.
But they didn't. I don't think they maybe didn't even respond. So I thought, right, okay, I'll contact Mike Alway. And I noticed or try and find Mike Alway. I noticed strangely that there's kind of a very reclusive character on the Cherry Red website, had an email address for him because because as you know, he still releases records under the el.e. name brand.
Yes.
Reissues. So he was on the deep, far down in the Cherry Red website. He was there. So I just emailed him and said, sent him the proposal, and he just came straight back and said, "Oh, this is great. If you need any help, let me know." And he was immediately very supportive of the whole thing.
Right.
So he helped me, get in touch with some of the other artists, and then through their other artists, I got in touch with, sort of built it up that way. And I did go and interview him. He lives in Sweden now, and I went over for a few days and spoke to him. Spent a whole day and a bit with him, talking about el.e. And it's just a really interesting person.
Yes.
I mean, you'll know this. You don't have to put this in the show, but you'll know this from doing your show, that sometimes people that make very interesting music are not very interesting people to talk to. Whereas Mike, he is really interested because he's interested in all the things we've just talked about: films, theatre, literature, the history of pop music from a strange angle, the history of classical music, jazz, world music. He's got this in sort of kaleidoscopic range of interest: photography, art. And I think that's why el.e. was such a quirky label, because it was, despite all the artists on it who are great, it was Mike's world that you're seeing played out across the label.
Yeah, so he loved the record. He loved the music that he was putting on curating.
Yeah.
So what was his kind of story then? How did he develop this, and how did he manage to sort of become part of Cherry Red?
Well, he was a music fan. Like, we grew up as a music fan, and he was a promoter in Richmond. He ran a club called Snoopy's in Richmond, Richmond upon Thames, not
Yes.
Richmond, North Yorkshire. And he had he I think he was in a band called Scissorfits, who he tried to market as the next Beatles, and he kind of, so he's working as a promoter, but he got a bit of a reputation, and I think at the time Ian McNay from who ran Cherry Red, he was looking for someone to work as like an A&R man for the label. And I think he got to hear about Mike and thought this guy's interesting, and brought him in to be Cherry Red's A&R. So Mike is the guy that put together Pillows and Prayers and signed all the bands that were on that label. So Felt, Everything But the Girl, before they're having the Girl, and it was Ben and Tracy on their own.
Yes.
Monochrome Set, Iris in Gaza, and all the other oddities that are on that compilation. So I think if you understand Pillows and Prayers and what that was about, that gives you a good sense of what Mike Alway was doing and was bringing to Cherry Red. And in my opinion, I think he sort of made the label what it was. He made it into that cool indie label that it became.
Yes. It was quite an interesting period as well, wasn't it? There was definitely like you were saying about the punk and post-punk, there was definitely that period where when a scene is kind of coming to an end, you need it to come to an end a bit quicker, don't you? Because it's getting a bit messy. So there was definitely a new wave of people and thinking and philosophy during that early 80s, which seemed, again, like I was saying, when I started listening to Sgt. Pepper in 74, 75, you know, the Beatles it felt like they were so old. And when you think about 81, it seems so different to the world of that punk, the start of punk, which was only, you know, 4 or 5 years before that, you know, that suddenly, and the world of the Sid Vicious, yes, all that kind of, what punk had sort of become, had become quite cliched and boring. And then suddenly it brought a sort of a feminine quality to it, I thought. Pillows and Prayers. There was a lot of sensitive people got into that compilation and collection, and it kind of defined you. You know, if you had a copy of that, you know, you were that sort of person. You went to the jumble cells, and you were a little bit. You were probably not very good at football, or even catching a tennis ball. But yeah, there was a sort of a self-consciousness about it, wasn't there?
Yeah, and I think Mike's, you know, favorite punk bands were bands like Wire, who were more arty, you know. So he was bringing that to Cherry Red, but also looking back to the 60s, especially the psychedelic period, which, you know, remember, was very uncool in the punk era. Anything sort of to do with, other than maybe the Stooges or somebody like that, was sort of treated with, you know, a lot of suspicion.
Yes,
So,
being able to a guitarist bending a note was just...
you know, Syd Barrett wasn't the cool figure he is now, you know, then. So I think he sort of already then was maybe going backwards and forwards a bit, you know, exploring what he thought was the interesting stuff from the past, but trying to bring it into the 1980s, bring it into the modern era and modernize it. So yeah, and what you get there is an emphasis on tunes and the words, and a non-rock, you know, a non-heavy guitar sound.
Yes, because kind of 83...
Acoustic guitars. I mean, that again, you know, no one played acoustic, you know, guitars in the punk, you know, in the punk era, so apart from Patrick Fitzgerald. So,
yes.
and Subway Sect, you know, he was a big fan of Vic Goddard, and they were always a bit different, you know, and they were early. They were on the, you know, tour with the Sex Pistols. So it was always about those artists that were a bit different and a bit more sensitive, that's the right word.
Yes.
Arty, sensitive, bookish.
And then
non-macho. There was nobody standing up against a brick wall in a leather jacket. It was fields, flowers, strange mists, and, atmosphere.
holding a copy of The Little Prince. It was always there, wasn't it?
Poetry.
Poetry. They absolutely loved the poetry. You had a chance with poetry. But then sort of 83, the Smiths come along, and then El Record starts in 84, doesn't it? There's no connection probably. But I still think that then when Morrissey came in the early days, what a man, there was a kind of a shift. There was definitely a 5-year narrative with the Smiths there. And he was so out there, and that kind of everything felt like it changed. So why did Mike then start El Records and not just keep part of Cherry Red?
Well, there was a weird but important bit in between where he got involved in a label called Blanco Y Negro, who released the first Everything But the Girl album and the Jesus and Mary chain. And Monochrome Set's Lost Weekend, which they're touring now, so that must be 40 years ago.
Yes.
But Monochrome Set were on Blanco Y Negro for a bit, and that was a partnership with Mike Alway, Jeff Travis from Rough Trade, and Michel Duval from La Dista Crepuscule, and they had money from Warner's to be like a incubator for bands. So they would sign cool indie bands and then develop them into big artists for commercial success. And I think Micro Disney were also on the label, but the only big success was Everything But the Girl, which was massive. But I don't think that big business world of the music, that part of the music business didn't appeal to Mike. He found it really hard to operate in that with big money and big, American sort of characters. And also, if you think of those three individuals, him, Jeff Travis, and Michel Duval, you've got three quite, individualistic, strong-willed, determined characters in their own right. And the idea that they could work together on a record label is just looks a bit weird. It's like you remember the Crucial Three, which was Ian McCulloch, Pete Wiley, and Julian Cope. They were in a band called the Crucial Three before they all went into that. And you just thought, can you imagine what that would, the rehearsals for somebody like that would be?
Yes.
It's just never going to work, So he didn't fit with that world. But he'd left Cherry Red to go and join these guys with Blanco Y Negro. So he'd really pissed off Ian McNay, and they fell out. But so after the Blanco Y Negro debacle, he wanted to get back and do something that he really believed in, and that was El. And he went back to Ian McNay and asked if he would support him, and they sort of made up, and Ian, to his credit, did back this new venture that was El Records. And so finally Mike was doing his own, what he wanted to do.
Right.
I think El was his, that was his thing. Although the other things he'd done were really interesting, I think this was finally, he thought he could realize what he thought popular pop music could be through El. And that was the start of it.
Yes, it probably could have only existed for those few, because how long did it last for?
Yeah, it was sort of, was it 83 to 86 or something like that?
Yes.
Not long. And remember, it changed. So the early El was people he'd already knew. So people like Nick Curry, who was in the Happy Family, with some guys from Joseph K, Monochrome Set, Bid, Carl Blake, Shock-Headed Peters, who'd been in the Lemon Kittens,
and Daniel Dax, I guess.
Yeah, Daniel Dax. and Klaxon 5, a group called Klaxon 5. So the early El stuff was sort of people that he sort of knew already. And some of that, I don't know if you know Shock-Headed Peters, but the I Blood Brother B, it's always on most of the El compilations. It's an incredible track.
Yes.
But it sounds a million miles away from what El became. But still, reminiscent of Mike's punk, post-punk stuff with Cherry Red and all that kind of thing, Wire and stuff like that. And then, so that was the early phase, and then that sort of fizzled out because again, you had some big characters, Bid, Carl Blake, Nick Curry. They were, they didn't want to do what Mike Alway asked them to do. They had their own ideas and were strong characters. So then the sort of second phase of El is when it's more like Mike creating bands and bringing people in who did buy into his world, would dress up in costumes, would pretend they were the King of Luxembourg or Louis XIV and whatever, Louis.
So that was the Simon Fisher Turner moment.
Simon Fisher Turner, Louis Philippe, Would Be Goods, Badgering Fancy Dress. People that were prepared to buy into it.
Right.
That's the golden age, I think, of El. When it was. And maybe it could only be short-lived because artists, they want to do their own thing. They don't want a guy running a label saying, "Here's some song titles. Here's something to wear. We're doing this photo shoot." I just don't think I think they can't. They can only do it for so long, and then they want to do their own thing. So I think it was never going to last.
I guess, yes. I suppose when we look back on anything, there's only a certain time, isn't there? And certain characters, you can only hold that kind of vision for so long.
Yeah, exactly.
And then after that, it's going to get very difficult because I suppose that's the genius of Bowie. In a way, he realised that he kept changing throughout the 70s at least, but not many people could pull that off really.
No, and also because he was so successful, he could do what he wanted really, whereas the El groups weren't commercially successful. So you've always got the money guys saying, "Why are we doing this again?" So it's a tension.
Yes. And how did Mike feel with those kind of that 4 years, that sort of first phase of the band, the first phase of the label?
Well, I think he was just kind of finding his feet with that. He fell back on people he knew that he thought would work for, and I mean that they are remarkable records. The first El, so the first El records were sort of partly backed by Factory Benelux, which is a Belgian sort of label, and so you had the first Momus EP. What's it called?
It's not the Circus one, is it?
No, that was the first album on El. Yeah, the Circus Maximus. It was an EP, The Beast with Three Backs. It's called.
Right.
That was one of the first things. Then you had the Shock-Headed Peters and Klaxon 5. So they are remarkable records, amazing records. But I don't think they weren't as unified as the things that came later into this sort of fantasy world of characters, of timeless sort of music, drawing on the 60s, drawing on like Brazilian bossa nova and film music. That wasn't in place until later on. And then you had someone like Marden Hill, who sort of almost bring it all together, but a sort of a single band who do stuff that sounds like film and could be film music, pop songs, instrumentals, very cinematic sound. So I think both periods are really good, really interesting, but I see them as quite distinct, and I think Mike does as well.
Yes. And then, because you mentioned the collection of sports, of football tracks. So what was his thinking with that?
Well, I think he just it was another thing from the past that he was fascinated by, the late 1960s and 1970s football world, where sort of flair and style first became acceptable. So people like George Best,
Yes.
I think he was really attracted to that, and thought that that was, and again, this is before. Well, it's kind of the same time as when Saturday comes, but before Fantasy Football League and before football became trendy again. It was really quite unfashionable when he brought out it was called Flair '89, the first football album. But before that, one of the first L releases was A Perfect Action. I don't know if you know that. It's a cricket concept album.
No.
Right. Okay. Well, that's definitely worth checking out. So that was put together by a group of people that sort of go back to the earlier days, like the Carl Blake sort of days of L. So that was Michael Madonna Jones and Bernadette Keefe. More sort of arty musicians so they created this performance piece called A Perfect Action. I don't know if it was called A Perfect Action, but it was this cricket concept thing, and they recorded it, and that became one of the first L records. So sport, certain aspects of sport, flair sport, were things that he was interested in as well.
Right.
I mean, maybe it's a bit more nostalgia. It's a bit looking back to an era when, but I mean, the football thing's complicated, and there's a lot you could say about that. But because I think then you had people like Eric Cantona, who kind of were in the spirit of that sort of cavalier approach to sport. So, but
Well,
then
we grew up in the 70s, and there was, I
yeah,
mean, you mentioned George Best, so there was people like Frank Worthington who came
yes,
along,
Stan Bowles.
and Stan Bowles, and then you had a load of other people who played for Chelsea and Tottenham, Alan Hudson and Tony Curry. I mean, sort of slightly, they had flair, they were slightly good looking. They was something quite flash about them. But yes, definitely, especially the Frank Worthingtons of this world and Bowles. Beautiful left foot football players. Probably never headed a ball, but just amazing touch, against this kind of backdrop of thuggery and muddy football pitches.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So there might have been all this flair going on the pitch, but certainly wasn't off the pitch.
But then you had the Malcolm Allison kind of era as well, didn't you? The flamboyant Allison, and this thing, was it Fiona Fullerton sort of being with Crystal Palace, having a shower with some of the players. I mean, obviously,
Page Three girls.
It was very, and then sport did have that thing though. You had motor racing, you had Hunt, didn't you?
Yeah.
James Hunt. Then you had Alex Higgins. So there was a sort of
Maverick.
And Barry Sheen, the number 7, was such a big thing in our lives.
Yeah, exactly that. And I guess also he just got interested in the music that was, football songs. So throwaway things, but, sometimes they'd hire someone like Tony Hatch, like Stoke City, hired Tony Hatch to write a song for them for when they won the cup in 1970, League Cup or something. I don't know. But you had these really serious musicians, with a real pedigree coming in and creating this stuff. And I think and don't forget that the idea of someone like Tony Hatch and that kind of 60s, 70s Eurovision, he appealed to Mike. The song that was created to order, but was still very clever in its own way, and was written by someone with real talent, like an English sort of Burt Bacharach type.
Yes.
And again, that was all unfashionable. But again, Burt Bacharach, no one could admit to liking him in the 1980s. So he was all of it, and then there was the thing where he got people to do their own football songs. So the reason I discovered Mike Alway was with the Flair compilation, no, Bend It, they were called, Bend It compilation, where you had football songs from the 70s mixed with songs by Louis Philippe and the Japanese artists like Cornelius and, the sort of people like Monty, who is in, I wrote about him in the book. He was an interesting guy that Mike discovered who could write sorts to order. So you got people writing football songs in the 80s and blending them with these real football songs. You couldn't really tell the difference. Incredible, really, but sort of a bit of a joke because it was football. But I do know that John Peel hated L Records, but he liked those football albums. He did play those to death,
Yes.
but because he was a football fan. And it caught a mood somehow, I think. But then Mike told me that he got sick of doing interviews on the radio where people say, "Oh yeah, but it's really bad, isn't it? That's why it's funny. It's so bad, it's good," sort of thing. And he would think, "No, it's not. I actually think this is interesting.
Yes.
It's got a spirit, and it's got a, a pathos that is real. Okay,
Yes.
you've got terrible football songs, but then you've got some that are quite moving. So yeah, I just think that's another interesting aspect to it.
It's interesting. Yeah, I know you mentioned Burt Bacharach, who I loved, and the Carpenters. And then sort of in the early 90s, there was a compilation that came out, If I Was a Carpenter, with people like Sonic Youth, Grant Lee Buffalo, the Cranberries, Sheryl Crow, and it was and Red Cross, and they all sort of did a cover of a Carpenter song, but in
Right.
style. And the Sonic Youth one is, if you haven't heard it, it is absolutely amazing. It really kind of, they get it so well. But then in '89 there was another compilation that came out called A Date with Elvis Lived in Leeds. It was the anti-poll tax record.
Oh,
I don't
yeah.
know if you remember that.
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
was like indie bands all covering those songs from the 70s that you would have thought, oh, these are really naff. But they did it. The Wedding Present was on it, and the Sidleys were on it, the Cud were on it, and they all did a song from that period for raising money. And so I think there was a shift during that period of the late 80s and into the 90s where, this is so naff. I'll play it because it makes me look quite enigmatic and interesting, to actually people genuinely enjoying it and saying actually I quite like these. So yeah, it's
And I
a
think
funny musical snobbery or artistic snobbery is always a strange one, really.
yeah, I think Mike always kind of averse to that. I think he'll always look for the opposite of what anyone is saying is, a work of genius. He'll look for in strange places for things. So he's a big fan of bubblegum pop, 60s American manufactured.
And there was a period as well that I remember feeling, again, that thing you should go and see that, or you must go, should go. And there was The Prisoner, wasn't there, that series?
Yeah.
And getting hold of those VHS cassettes from some friend who'd recorded them and then watching them and said, God, they were brilliant. I could relate to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he's kind of lamenting that kind of, and the Avengers is a big thing for him, and also the films of Powell and Pressburger. They're highly stylized.
Yes,
it's a world. What you've got there is a unique world of its own, and that's what L was trying to be. It wasn't, oh, we're recreating Andy Warhol's factory, or oh, we're going back to the the Beatles. It was meant to be a world of its own, like their films are. There's nothing else like them, and you have to enter into that and buy into it, which a lot of people can't.
yes.
And Orson Welles, people that filmmakers, musicians, whoever they are, that photographers that create their own world. That's what he's interested in. That's what he's trying to do, I think, anyway. And that's why I find it interesting.
Yes.
I find it more interesting than creation, because I think then what you had with creation was people trying to do this, the late 60s and the early 70s, but in the 80s, and really not hiding the fact that they were copying the Velvet Underground or the Stones. And I think that's for me, that's less interesting. I mean, even though Creation was much more popular, obviously, and hugely successful.
Yeah, but in the 90s, 80s, you would have not put much money on that being a success.
Well, I suppose the success was down to Oasis, wasn't it? And to
Yes.
some extent, Primal Scream. You're right. If you take those out of the equation, it wasn't very successful.
You were thinking, don't give up. Yes, you think, this is, after My Bloody Valentine, and it was like, yes, it was a great record, but it still wasn't going to pay your pension. And then there was Sugar, which obviously was a clever move by Alan to sign Bob Mould, and that was but it wasn't mega bucks at that stage.
And I think Alan McGee is not. He's not the visionary that Mike is. I think he's an interesting guy. He was very much influenced by Mike. I mean, he loved The King of Luxembourg, Simon Turner's version of Valerie, the Monkees song. He just couldn't figure out how they did that, how they created that sound. So he was copying Mike, but I don't think in as interesting way. But that's just what I think. People love Creation. People love Alan McGee, but don't think he's got the same visionary quality as Mike. It's just that Mike's vision, no one understood it. Whereas they did understand a bunch of guys with leather trousers making a noise,
Yes. Well, then how does El and Mike cope with the 90s then, navigating that period?
Yeah, so I think, he did the football things, but again, with that, he got sick of it eventually. And then that carried on through a guy called Jim Phelan, who did a lot of the design work for El and Creation, by the way. So he's an interesting character in his own right, but he carried on the football stuff. But Mike, I'm not sure really. I think in the 90s he did a bit of work for Alan McGee actually. He what was McGee's? Was it Pop Tones?
That's right. Yes, when he had exited Creation.
He went more into the design aspect, working with his wife at the time, Gina Harp. They became more like designers. And then towards the end, he starts reissuing things on El, which is the phase we're at now, where it's a reissue label.
Yes.
One of many. But again, it has Mike's personality stamped all over it. If you look at the discography of El in the last 20 years, it's just a bizarre collection.
Yes.
Stuff from sort of Stockhausen to, Ellis Regina, just it's all sort and everything in between, Margot Gurian, just anything interesting. The free design. Yeah.
So was the last thing he released was 2002 with Milky, Death by Chocolate and Hunky Dory?
Yes. So you've just reminded me, missed something out then. So after El, he did have another label which was called If.
Right.
That had some of the El people on it. Had Simon Turner was on it, Bid was on it, Nick Curry. Nick Curry was Milky with his wife at the time. So yeah, that was an interesting phase. I don't know if you know that the first Songs from the Jet Set, the first that was a partnership with Siesta, Spanish record label, and
right,
Cherry Red, and I think an American label as well, actually. Can't remember who that was, but that was another phase, which was really interesting. I liked the early El stuff, and he found a sort of new generation of artists to work with. A guy called Jez Butler, it was like a sort of one-man production house. He was like a Tony Hatch, he just did everything. His group now is called 12 Hour Foundation. Just kind of retro-y electronic music. Very interesting guy.
Blimey,
very interesting guy.
You must love research, mustn't you? Because this is just you can go down rabbit holes here, can't you?
Absolutely. And then there's So sorry, I forgot about El, that El Siesta period. That was really interesting at the sort of 2000s. And then he does the reissue stuff. Yeah.
Right. and that's it. Because his last release was the James Dean driving experience.
So that was, so there were a couple of things released on El after he left that he had nothing to do with, where Cherry Red tried to think they could keep it going by just using the name. So he had nothing to do with that James Dean Driver. And there was a second Anthony Adverse LP that he had nothing to do with. So that was Cherry Red trying to cash in on El.
Yes, it kind of fits perfectly with the decade, really, doesn't it? The 80s period, actually. And
he does kind of remind me a bit of Orson Welles. You know how Orson Welles he was just like genius, but he could never fit into the film industry. He ended up doing like commercials and stuff just for money and kind of prostituting himself in a way, and just never fitting. You know, his view of the world and what his film should be was just never connecting with the film industry as it was. You know, and I feel Mike was a bit like that with music. All his ideas just jarred with the music industry. There was almost an irreconcilable sort of clash, you know, of cultures almost. I mean, you must have met a lot of record company business people. There's a lot of, considering what a cool and sort of creative thing music can be, there's a lot of accountants involved in it.
Yes, it's a little bit, it's nice when something is done for the sake of the art. I mean,
for art's sake.
You know, and it's like, well, you might not like it, but it's out there, it's done, we'll move on. And actually that discography is fantastic, actually. It's such a beautiful piece of work. There's nothing that doesn't fit into that period in the 80s.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Yeah,
and
that's
kind
strange.
That is kind of genius, and the people, because I've interviewed quite a lot of the people in some of those bands, and it's like, God, yeah, they do all kind of fit in a strange way. I mean, if only he had Lawrence from Felt, I think you'd have done it by then, wouldn't you?
Yeah, he did. So that was another thing. I think that Felt album that came out on El was again after Mike had left. But again, Lawrence is, you know, you wouldn't want to. I don't. He's not going to listen to what you say for very long. He's got to do his own thing. So I think what you're saying is right, that those guys are perfect for El in one way, but in another way they're terrible for El because they won't dress up and they won't write a song that Mike Alway gives them the title for. So it's interesting.
Yes. Yeah. So what does Mike do now? Is he just happily retired?
Well, I think he just works on these El reissues, which come out regularly, and they're sort of box set compilations of. I mean, as you know, there's a whole industry of that. So Bob Stanley does things for Ace. John Savage is always bringing out compilations.
I know you can't.
It's a bit like he's doing that, but in a Mike way. So they're reissuing classics from the soul, you know, the 60s and whatever, and whereas Mike's bringing out, you know, a Stravinsky box set or an Eric Satie box set or something.
Oh, we loved Satie.
Yeah.
Sweet.
But the next one is a Monica Zetterlund. I don't know if you know her. She was like a Swedish jazz singer. That's going to be the next one, the next El release.
I'll have to check.
So, you know, it's still Mike. It's all reissues. It's all catalog, but back catalog. But it's got his stamp on it, his mark on it, all the way through it.
And Absolutely. He must have been delighted. Have you sent him, and has he read the book?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I think he was really pleased that I was doing it, and he went along with it all the way and was really grateful. But I think there's part of him that doesn't want to read it. I don't think he wants. Maybe he's worried that he's going to be disappointed, or I don't know. But I sense a reluctance for him to read it for some reason.
Yes,
strange.
It must be quite strange. I remember he was at Joseph Kay doing an interview with both the author, but then also the main man, and I don't think he'd read the book because it's probably a bit tricky, isn't it? Somehow.
Oh, the Paul Haig.
Yeah. It's
Do you know that book? Because it's not a very good. I mean, I was really disappointed with that. I thought because I loved Postcard. Oh, is this Joseph? Oh, is this the Scott? Is this the Scottish thing? It's
Johnny
not
John.
the. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm thinking of the Postcard book.
Oh yes, I've got that here.
Simon. It's not Simon Goddard, is it?
It
What's
is
his name?
Simon Goddard. Simply Thrilled.
Yeah, I was really disappointed with that because he tried to sort of tell it like a story with Edwin and Alan Horn as kind of characters, and I just couldn't get it. Yeah,
No,
but I know what you mean. Yeah, that's the post-punk Scottish thing, right?
yes,
So Paul Haig hadn't read it. No, well, you wouldn't want to really, would you? I think he likes. I
no.
think he wants to keep the myth there. Keep the what do you call it? The enigma.
Mystique, I
The
guess.
mystique, yeah, that's the word. And if someone writes a book, it ruins that. So he was being very gracious and helpful, but I suspect he doesn't really want to read it.
No, but he must at the same time, because be pleased that there's this kind of interest, because a bit like the famous C86 cassette that sold well, then they put
Yeah.
out a triple CD, and then they went, oh, let's do C87, 88, got up to 91, then went back to 85, and they must think there are kids who are just buying this now, and the people who were there at the time, because the inheritance has come through or something. So I mean, and suddenly you're having, well, Wedding Present, the musical, it's just,
It
it's
comes
got,
round, yeah. Yeah, if you stick around long enough, that's it, isn't it? There's so many stories of people, like Vashti Bunyan is one that comes to mind, who
oh my
just
God.
disappeared for about 40 years and then came back, and someone discovered that album. And then she made
Yes.
a new one 40 years later, second album 40 years later. And then she did tours, and then the whole thing comes to life. So I think you've got to keep alive, stay alive, and
Stay Alive.
your time will come.
And then
But
someone, because I think it was, I can't remember who there was like two or three women who made a couple of albums, totally disappeared. No one knows anything about them. And then they make a film about them, and they just managed to get a few people to talk about them.
yes,
And Nick Cave likes them and somebody else. And it's like, right, we've got a film now. We're going for it. Which is, I think people are always kind of interested in the curiosity. That's why I would imagine Elle will suddenly become very popular, because there's a sort of vibe, isn't there? I remember in the 90s when Austin Powers came out, and there was that guy called, was it Mike Flowers?
yes,
Started
Mike
doing
Flowers.
doing these kind of, and there was it the soundtrack to porn films that became suddenly like people quite like them, this kind of incidental, rather jazzy music, which was,
Somebody. That's what happens, isn't it? Somebody discovers it who's like Jarvis Cocker, someone who's influential, and that's all you need. But the strange thing about Elle is, in a way, it was more popular, in other territories. It was really popular in Japan. It was a massive influence on the J-pop scene and the Shibuya. What's it called? Shibuya K. The
right.
Tokyo, Pizzicato 5, Cornelius, Kei Mikari, massive stars in Japan, but they started by, it was Elle Records that they discovered these records on import and just transformed it all. So I think they were, and the book's published by a German publisher, and there's a load of people in Germany who are big Elle fans. There's a few Americans who ran their own labels who I talk about in the book. I mean, it's almost like it was more popular, even though everyone said it was a quintessentially English label, people wearing bowler hats and trying to pretend they were in The Prisoner. It was strangely not popular here and more popular overseas.
There's a lot of artists often say, God, we're really big in Italy or
Right.
Spain. It's quite interesting, interviewing people, and they go, yes, we only do a few dates in Italy, but we'll sell out 2,000, 3,000. And it's interesting enough, there was a label in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s called Sarah Records, which was a bit shoegazy, really. But big in Japan, really big.
I think that, Sarah was a kind of follow on from El in a way, I think, in the way that creation was what, the sound of creation was very retro-y and very rock, whereas Sarah was sort of a bit noisier than El, but yeah, the same philosophy, that philosophy of quite, shyness and, celebrating kind of awkwardness and things.
Yes.
Yeah, it's strange. And also you had, the big guy on El was Philippe Auclair, who's French. So it was very English, but also not as well. It was European. And I think that Mike's Songs from the Jet Set, I think, was interesting because that was kind of like the global pop sort of idea of, pop music jetting in from all around the world. Not from the usual American blues source, but from Spain, Brazil, France.
Yes.
And again, French, Gainsbourg, I think no one thought that wasn't cool either.
No, Jacques
until
Brel.
recently. Yeah,
Yes.
No one knew about that. No, everyone thought French, no one listened to anything that was sung in French.
No,
even though there were some French punk bands, but yeah, weird.
It's interesting.
Unique.
So how long did it take to do the book, by the way?
Well, I didn't have very long, so the deal was it had to be written in about a year.
Right.
So it's very fast. It's maybe why there's one or two errors in it, a bit too quick, but it is what it is. It was done that exists. It was done quite quickly. Spoke to as many people as I could, wrote it. This took me a while to figure out how to do it. I don't know if you know a guy called Ian Penman. He wrote a book about Fassbinder. He's a music writer.
Yes, I have.
He's just written one on Eric Satie, actually. Really good. I was kind of inspired by him because he wrote his Fassbinder book. It was just like numbered sections, almost more like footnotes. And his Satie book is the same. It's got a little biography of Satie, then it's got an A to Z of Eric Satie, and then it's got a diary of him listening to Eric Satie. 3 sort of weird sections.
Yes.
And I thought, okay, you can do it like this. You don't have to just tell the story from the beginning to the end. So I was a bit concerned that would irritate people, but it doesn't seem to have irritated anyone yet. The fact it's written in a strange way. Did they send you a copy then, Dave?
No, I just got a PDF actually.
Oh, right. It's a bit...
But don't worry, I mean, it's such a good book. I definitely will sort of just buy a copy. But yes, it's not. I was just looking at some of your bibliography. Actually, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, well, that's always interesting, isn't it? I always look at bibliographies and see what else people have been. People want me. It's quite instructive. That goes back to what we started talking about in a way, where the eclectic, you say, okay, yeah, there's a book about creation, there's a book about Sarah, but wait a minute, there's something about, French poetry or something,
Well, there's the 6 memos for the next millennium.
Oh, yeah. Calvino, yeah.
Which was interesting. And another one about the children of Albion, poetry of the underground in Britain.
Yeah. Well, the Calvino book, before he died, he wrote this lecture about what he thought the next millennium, what were going to be the features of the next millennium. And one of them he called lightness. And I thought, wow, that's kind of what people have always said El was doing. It wasn't the heavy stuff. It wasn't the Joy Division. It wasn't the industrial, miserable kind of, it was light. It was about things that were fresh and kind of airy and poetic and flowery and sunny and kind of opposite of that in a way. So that just struck me as an interesting. I don't know if that is a feature of the current millennium that we're in. Lightness. I wouldn't feel like that at the moment, but
no,
that's what he thought.
Anyway, well, I've seen that a few times recently. I must go, and obviously Dorothy Max Pryor, who we love so much.
Oh yeah. Have you spoken to her?
Yes, and she's got a new book out. So
Well, that's it. You see, there's a good example of someone that you could, she died in 1991. We probably wouldn't know anything about her, but because she's written this memoir and you can join the dots. Oh, she was the drummer in the Monochrome Set. She knew Adam and the Ants. Suddenly the whole thing.
And the famous Rima
Genesis
Rima.
Theorage. Rima, great. I mean, isn't that?
And have you seen the film?
What a band. No, I haven't seen. Is there a film about them?
Yes.
Oh, okay. God, there's a film about everyone now, isn't there?
But I mean, that's quite good because they only lasted 8 months and did one EP and they managed to get a film from it. But if you watch it, you'll be absolutely mesmerised.
I love that. I love that EP. I've always loved it. So it's really good. I couldn't understand why no one else liked it.
No. But from that, you had almost the beginning of 4AD. You had Adamant and obviously Renegade Soundwave. So, So it's, yes, I mean, it's just a fascinating, things continue. But these little memoirs that people are writing are actually interesting. They do sort of bring more depth to the narrative, which is...
they do, because because we don't need another book by John Savage or something. We've got, they've done it. They've done it all, those guys. I want to hear something new. I want to hear from Dorothy Max Pry. That's who I want to hear.
Yes.
A book. And to be fair to this lot who published the L book, the book before mine was about the television personalities. And then the one they've just done is Reckless Eric's autobiography. And now they've done this L thing. So there's 3 books about poking into little corners of the history of music that no one thought they needed.
Yes, well, I know. And they've got fantastic stories. Eric's now living in North Norfolk with Amy. So they've relocated from New York and now live here. So, yes, Amy's doing bits and pieces around here.
Do you know George McKay?
Yes.
I thought you might know him.
A Senseless Acts of Beauty.
Because he's at UEA.
Yeah, so he's...
I thought you might know him.
Mr. Culture. And James Nice, he's in the area as well.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, he lives in North Norfolk somewhere.
Oh, he's doing a good job. I mean, that's a label, the Dista Crepuscule, that's a label that someone should write a book about.
Yes.
Before one of them's already died, hasn't she? Ian Curtis's girlfriend.
Yes.
She started a label with Michelle, but she died a few years ago. But Michelle's still around, I think.
Right. My God. Well, look.
Amazing. Yeah.
Well, Mark, I'll let you get on, but thank you ever so much for this. And yes,
pleasure.
And I can always send you a link if you want to the interview, and then you can use it elsewhere. But good luck on the band. I'm going to have to check out your band now, the Rudolf.
Yeah, I'll let you know when the new album is finally finished.
It sounds good. It's looking good.
Yeah. So
a nice project. Anyway, look, I'll let you go on. Yeah. But thanks ever so much for your time. Yeah. Okay.
Good to
Take care there. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
The listener is obviously the end of the interview. A massive thanks to Mark for giving me the time for that interview. This has been the C86 show, David Eastaugh. So if you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 show, all the social media platform sites. All these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, and all those other things. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.